Let's present virtually our successful junior high school completers of class 2021 by the respective class advisors. Starting with grade 10 Nara. Class advisor, Mrs. Carmelita R. Arong.
Grade 10 Nara. Arsenal Kent Joshua R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juben and Margie Arsenal. Canales Nicolay James C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime and Maria Doris Canales. Katadman BG C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pablito and Joey Katadman. Condi Gabriel B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernando and Annalyn Condi. Dilao Christian M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Rosa Dilao. Elostrissimo Jerome. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Richard and Maria Gina Elostrissimo. Malinaw Angelo D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald and Lucelle Malinaw. Manango Humphrey V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Murphy Manango. Manzanares Bensley M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Maria Leslie Manzanares. Monterde Richie A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo and Marisa Monterde. Omandak Luis Emmanuel M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elmer and Maria Marilyn Omandak. Patalita Christian G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro and Helda Patalita. Pipito Joshua. Parent, Miss Lorena Pipito. Rodrigo Sidney Russell L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Victor and Florami Rodrigo. Rosel Jo Marie M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joselito and Maribel Rosel. Santusidad Neil Andrew D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. GC and Rowena Santosidad. Siricon John Gregory P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Efren and Glenn Siricon. Tangiris Clifford A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wendell and Maria Isabel Tangiris. Aranchado DC Jane R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel and Anisita Aranchado. Aribado Pearly Chris R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dante and Josephine Aribado. Brusas Elame T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny and Rebelin Brosas. Buayaban Marchi Miguel. Parents, Mrs. Mernalyn Buayaban. Kamingaw Nika P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo Jr. and Ninita Kamingaw. Katadman Reben Ara C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ilyazar and Cecil Katadman. Comendador Marby R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Miraflor Comendador. Conde Richel Ann C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ilyazar and Telma Condi. Condi Diana Rose L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel and Lorena Condi. Kuyuka Nina J. C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel and Jelu Kuyuka. Daiday Leticia Wayne M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dulwich and Maricel Daiday. De La Puente Flor de Luna T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hermilo and Marianisma de La Puente. Erasmo Harem Alexa O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romulo and Jennifer Erasmo. Espinoza Roslyn M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elino Rosalie Espinosa. Pajardo Maria Jusel. Parents, Miss Griselda Pajardo. Gastador Heli Shamel B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramel and Maria Lee Gastador. Columbo Carla L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelson and Delia Hilonggo. Mangubat Mary Shandy M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ibon and Lida Mangubat. Pasahi Richel Ann. Parents, Miss Teresita Pasahi. Pastor Pili Neliza P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rino and Marilyn Pastor Pili. Pipito Eldami R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elmer and Dali Pipito. Pino Marifil O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Divorcio and Maria P. Pino. Placencia Jamaica A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricto and Musisa Placencia. Punay Joanna Marie R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Demetrio and Mildred Punay. Kihuti Crystalme B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Maximiliano Jr. and Shirley Kihuti. Kilaton Kyla May M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alan and Devina Kilaton. Rosales Nevelyn B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo and Rudelin Rosales. Rusas Fritz Erica L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricky and Vivian Rusas. Rosel Lian Zarina M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Dimber and Rubina Rosette. Zalazar Cara Isabel O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nonilon Jr. and Ayla Salazar. Next, Grade 10 Acacia, Class Advisor, Miss Ashlyn Miss C. Canales.
Grade 10 Acacia. Arabis Kim M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nicasio and Maria Lygin Arabis. Arangues Francis Arvin B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Mona Lisa Arangues. Arreglo John Kyle E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marvin and Melanie Arreglo. Baconador Jeremy Y. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro and Julieta Baconador. Batus-Batusan Romel B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo and Milona Batus-Batusan. Beryoel Robert John M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon and Rosalie Beryoel. Pugtong Jameson M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samson and Analisa Bugtong. Capisnon Agosto A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bencito and Maria Ruby Capisnon. Carbonquillo Daniel John O. Parent, Miss Juana Carbonquillo. Conde Paul Edward T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel and Annalyn Conde. Condes Kyle Eugene S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eugene and Eva Condes. Coyuca Cyrus Dan L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo and Marina Coyuca. Escalicas Jeter U. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Judito and Jocelyn Escalicas. Giliano John Rex C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph and Jennifer Giliano. Hihapon Keith Roger R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio and Mary Jane Hihapon. Magdadaro J. A. Parent, Miss Nandita Aranchado. Melendres John Cameron P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel and Elvira Melendres. Mendoza Christian Franz A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edelberto and Viviana Mendoza. Monterde Clint Christian B. Parents, Jonathan and Mincy Monterde. Nakwa John Fulbert R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Fulbert and Maria Verna Nakwa. Perino Danny D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elpedio and Marisol Perino. Pitugo Julius Cesar D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher and Nilfa Pitugo. Rodrigo Ninio Fit A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roy and Arlene Rodrigo. Son Michael Cedric D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reggie and Mildred Son. Vilando Raymart S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Merlina Vilando. Yaguno Isidore R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher and Ronelia Yaguno. Yasser Jeffrey N. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Porferio and Jennifer Yasser. Alahid Maricris D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pedro and Emilia Alahid. Banagbanag Christine P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lazaro and Maria Nila Banagbanag. Canales Niñalin A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Marites Canales. Capuras Gigi May O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerome and Jendi Capuras. Cartesiano Sofia P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Clarence and Marianita Cartesiano. Compuesto Tricia Joy O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alben and Julie Compuesto. Coyuca Georgeline T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elenito and Florenda Coyuca. Cuyus Alexis Christogen C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eric and Lidsel Cuyus. Gastador Casey K. L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Solomon Jr. and Marietta Gastador. Lau Mariel K. Parent, Miss Lenny Lau. Misa Nikki Ann H. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin and Nita Misa. Undangan si Sarah Jane N. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Elisa Undangan. Orbeta Canacerin S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cherry and Lorena Orbeta. Pino Niña May U. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joselito and Mary Ann Pino. Rivera Sheila May C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo Jr. and Maricel Rivera. Rodrigo Denise Ann P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fido and Blisel Rodrigo. Rodrigo Katrina S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Relax and Maria Marve Rodrigo. Rondina Angela May M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Jr. and Marilyn Rondina. Rosel Dana Nicole A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Aurelio Jr. and Jean Rosel. Rosel Mary Mar Y. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino and Mary Jane Rosel. Santos Regine Rose D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Erinaldo and Gina Santos. Saplad Regine Rose C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo and Geraldine Saplad. Sericon Kennedy R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Geralito and Lucia Sericon. Soko Izora Faith P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Glorious John Paul and Maricho Soko. Next, Grade 10 Ebony. Class Advisor, Ms. Ferdinand C. Higot.
Grade 10 Ebony. Arsenal Kim Chester M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Elmerito and Angeli Arsenal. Arsenal Ranches Luis G. Parent, Mrs. Maria Zeneth Arsenal. RCP Joseph B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador and Gemma RCP. Ariglo Angelo G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Angelito and Maria Lorna Ariglo. Aribado Roldan. Guardian, Mrs. Godilia Aribado. Baguio James S. Parent, Miss Ligaya Baguio. Bugtong Michael R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Selwyn and Virginia Bugtong. Capisnon Christian A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vincito and Ruby Capisnon. Compuesto Jerome M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin and Irene Compuesto. Condino Jeric C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. and Rubina Condino. Kuyuka Emmanuel Jr. C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Emmanuel and Zinaida Kuyuka. Kuyuka Roylam D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roel and Rosaline Kuyuka. Kuyuka Teresito G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ricardo and Rusa Kuyuka. Gailo Junway J. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henry and Merlina Gailo. Hilungo Lyndon D. Parent, Miss Mayet Hilungo. Luwingas Nico. Parent, Miss Miraluna Luwingas. Monterde G. Clyde R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rene and Susan Monterde. Monterde Richard S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo and Mersoli Monterde. Panghubasan Rocky R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Riden and Los Viminda Panghubasan. Parageli Reketh John R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronaldo and Gina Paragili. Pinoti Joshua A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Marjorie Pinoti. Placencia Kyle Marjon D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Mary Ann Placencia. Rodrigo Paul Albert B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Erwin and Flora Rodrigo. Rodrigo Rickniel R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cerveliano and Maria Clinia Rodrigo. Rosal Jeff Nino Hinise A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Petronilo and Florita Rosel. Talbos Vincent John Kyle R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar and Romilda Talbos. Tirana Mark Kenneth M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rico and Nelby Tirana. Alves Villet K. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Colmasio III and Lisa Alves. Arabis Princess May V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ranolfo and Helen Arabis. Cambaya Queen Jocelyn V. Parent, Mrs. Maria Rosalyn Cambaya. Castañeda Bea G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruben and Idna Castañeda.
Conde Karen L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eusebio and Maria Cecilia Conde. Diaz Kathleen C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnny and Leonidas Diaz. Lanorias Sandara P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renato and Roxanne Lanorias. Lobon Annalyn Roche L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rochelle and Cheryl Lubon. Magdadaro RV Rose A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rowell and Vivian Magdadaro. Mandawe Erica L. Parent, Miss Rosana Mandawe. Melendres Jeremy A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gerardo and Vilma Melendres. Mondihar Christina Paula M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romel and Visminia Mondihar. Monterde Ronafe C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo and Edita Monterde. Osabel Carol Jane E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo and Rosalie Osabel. Pipito Kizaya Rose V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Ray and Maria Christine Pipito. Pipito May P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramilito and Teresita Pipito. Pipito Moraine R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dindo and Virginia Pipito. Placencia Jolly Sheen C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Corazon Placencia. Rodrigo Jessa C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Corpus Jr. and Evelyn Rodrigo. Rosel Marialyn A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Janicio and Virginia Rosel. Serato Alaysa. Parent, Miss Arkel Serato. Tahanlangit Aryan Nadeshda P. Parent, Mr. and Mrs. Jaime and Luchil Tahanlangit.
Perez Sheena D. Parent, Mrs. Susana Perez.
Next, Brayton Jimelina. Class Advisor, Mrs. Maricel M. Dayday. Grade 10 Jimelina. Barcenas Brent Kidson L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Achilles and Jonah Barcenas. Coyoca Janrico B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall and Ramona Coyoca. Destacamento Sian Kim C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Louie and Jenny Destacamento. Diaz Vermil P. Parent, Miss Marifel Diaz. Gastador Andres Y. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Catalino and Julieta Gastador. Gastador Tenny Y. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Catalino and Julieta Gastador. Jaril Jamli B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Averil and Rochelle Jaril. Jimenez Jesuit James M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Erwin and Maristel Jimenez. Lekigan Dave John L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto and Agostina Lekigan. Minoras Justin A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernando and Gina Magbag. Orkia John Paul T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan and Angelica Orkia. Pascobilio Clint Andre. Parent, Miss Daphne Pascobilio. Pino Aldrian M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar and Algie Pino. Pino John Edney O. Parents,
Mr. and Mrs. Neptuno and Edita Pino. Punay Adrian O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edison and Julieta Punay. Punay Adrian O. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edison Punay. Kitoriano Eljon C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. LD and Jesselyn Kitoriano. Rodrigo John Marco A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilfredo and Jean Rodrigo. Rosel Bridal John A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Brian and Adelina Rosel. Rosel JPG. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Warlito and Carlita Rosel. Rubio Leonard B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leo and Lucia Rubio. Sugarol Melchor Jr. M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Melchor and Sheila Sugarol. Torrevilla Richard A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodrigo and Rosalina Torrevilla. Toyak Alfredo Jr. A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo and Cecilia Toyak. Valenzuela John Manuel C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Felipe Luz Valenzuela. Villarmia Kyle M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ederlito Jr. and Monien Villarmia. Villegas Arnel M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Serio and Lilibeth Villegas. Aluba Lalamay P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Yolando and Maria Christy Aluba. Angkahas Shaina Rose N. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nino and Leah Angkahas. Arcipe Rose Ann B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador and Gemma Arcipe. Arabis Chiny Rose P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pellman and Melanie Arabis. Bahinting Maria Eleonor R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eleuterio and Norma Bahinting. Balansag Sweet Rose N. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgardo and Resilda Balansag. Bailusis Jekyla P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Heraclio Celerina Bailusis. Briones Richel T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Carmelita Briones. Conde Rami Jane P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Romil and Mary Ann Conde. Condes Mary Pauline P. Parents, Miss Jocelyn Condes. Coyoca Mary Ann P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo Victoria Coyoca. Cuna Maria Ana A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. George and Glinda Cuna. Kutab Emmy Rose B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Melvin and Russell Kutab. Langido Erich Grace M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodney and Mabel Langido. Marijuan Roxanne P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Josporo and Flores Marijuan. Melendres Mary Janua G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto and Anastasia Melendres. Montalban Mary Claire R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rico and Rosalinda Montalban. Pahuriray Mariel C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodolfo and Melanie Pahuriray. Placencia Rhea Marie R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynante and Luz Biminda Placencia. Rivas Cherilyn S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel and Vilma Rivas. Rodrigo Lizel R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Melinda Rodrigo. Sumalinog Gina Marie T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynaldo and Elriza Sumalinog. Tahanlangit Criza C. T. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and Rosalina Tahanlangit. Next is Grade 10 Lawaan, Advisor, Mrs. Genoveva G. Patimo.
Grade 10 Lawaan. Alahid John Christian A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronelo and Dolores Alahid. Ariglo Edric R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edie and Cherelle Pino. Ariglo Janrel B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Juanilo and Lilita Ariglo. Bacunador Lester M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador and Elisa Bacunador. Buhawi Jojen P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jupiter and Bichil Buhawi. Kundis Christian C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Milicio and Jocelyn Kundis. Kuyuka Angelo B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto and Victoria Kuyuka. Dinoy John Rutsin E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nestor and Janta Dinoy. Desierto Carl John C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose and Jennifer Desierto. Doncilio Russell D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Randy and Anselma Doncilio. Gastador John Yori C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Jory and Joanne Gastador. Heraldis James Carl M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pidito and Anita Heraldis. Inot Tinberg A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto and Igna Inot. Hahora Rorijan S. Parent, Mrs. Maria Aurora Hahura. Lakuptan Earl John R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronnie and Annabel Lakuptan. Lesera Mark Lloyd S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelo and Grace Lesera. Lubun Mark James A. Parents, Miss Mira Lubun. Mabali Nico J. M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nathaniel and Nisil Mabali. Mantos Mark Leonard R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo Jr. and Annalisa Mantos. Mendoza Edgar Jr. S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar and Rosalie Mendoza. Monterde Mark Lester R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph and Lizelle Monterde. Montesa Marquen M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lim and Rowena Montesa. Nogra Kenneth T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Sergio Jr. and Lilibeth Nogra. Papuaya BJ M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. John and Annabel Papuaya. Placencia Rex Van A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Maribeth Placencia. Rodrigo Adrian T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Jr. and Marivic Rodrigo. Rodrigo Ferland R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Reynanti and Teresita Rodrigo. Rosas Glenmar A. Parent, Miss Annabel Rosas. Ruiz Norin John M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nori and Mirabilin Ruiz. Siricon John Paul I. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Emigdio and Rosalie Siricon. Yungzon John N.
Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jason Anthony and Lizelle Chungzon. Zamora Carl Jade R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cirilo and Janet Zamora. Aragon Reyna Grace A. Parent, Mr. Reynanti Aragon. Aranchado Lenly C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Noli and Liza Aranchado. Ariglo Jennifer Kyla E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marvin and Melanie Ariglo. Bragat Mariel M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raylan and Marister Bragat. Boraska Ashley P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vivencio Jr. and Lord Boraska. Cabradilla Queni D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Brian and Emilisa Cabradilla. Cagado Mary Marley M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Liberato and Chima Cagado. Damayo Nikki Jean C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Giselita Damayo. Montana Jaime Jane O. Parent, Mr. Jaime Montana. Montejo Rhea A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo and Maria Betchave Montejo. Nies Gwyneth E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jolifine and Yuvihelda Nies. Pipito Jamaica D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar and Mila Pipito. Punay Karel May. Parent, Miss Jacqueline Punay. Rivera Altia Grace B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jerry and Marites Rivera. Rosales Sofia S. Parent, Mr. and Mrs. Pio and Sally Rosales. Rubio Reyame S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin and Marilyn Rubio. Sino Cherry Ann G. Parent, Miss Velma G. Sino. Vito Valerie R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eustaquio and Velma Vito. Next, Grade 10 Mahogany. Subclass Advisor, Mrs. Irene L. Hukdong.
Grade 10 Mahogany. Alba John Albert A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albert and Jonaby Alba. Arabis Denver M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis and Victoria Arabis. Aison Kid Jasper M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ryan and Cheryl Aison. Bartolome John Warren A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruel and Anaria Bartolome. Bayot Clint Vincent R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Cesario and Jerenda Bayot. Cabag Arnel R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnolfo and Miguelita Cabag. Katana Levy. Parents, Miss Janet M. Katana. Conde Mike Vince B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ruben and Mary Ann Conde. Condrelion John Ace B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leo and Marvic Condrelion. Conejos J. Lord I. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin and Annalyn Conejos. Davis Arthur John R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ronald and Mary Lou Davis. Doble Marciano III M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marciano Jr. and Wenibel Doble. Golfan John Oliver A. Parents, Miss Jodeth A. Golfan. Lantaco John Michael D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Michael and Lorilyn Lantaco. Magno John Ray S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Annalisa Magno. Matiga Kenneth J. A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander and Maylene Matiga. Montaño Jamel C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dingdong and Gemma Montaño. Orbeta Darin Kyle C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Helvin Chris and Realyn Orbeta. Pipito John Mar P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bienvenido and Maria Fe Pipito. Punay Jack Alphonse C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richmond and Michelle Punay. Rosel John Bryle C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Demetrio Jr. and Marinel Rosel. Sericon Kemp A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rosalio and Aneta Sericon. Tayong John Michael A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Stevenson and Grace Tayong. Alday Marnie C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernie and Marilo Alday. Arabis Shedafi T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ranolfo and Hazel Arabis. Balberona Lira Jane. Parents, Miss Abelia Balberona. Baryoga Roan May R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roneo and Rosalyn Baryoga. Baryoga Rosie May R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roneo and Rosalyn Baryoga. Cabrera Shanley D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carlos Jr. and Lorena Cabrera. Cabusa Eliza S. Parents, Miss Lizelle S. Cabusa. Conde and Jane S. Parents, Miss Janeline S. Conde. Conde Christine B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael and Bebelin Conde. Constantino Shaina Jamela I. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ernesto and Lane Constantino. Dakayana Honey Rose I. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Aneto and Jane Dakayana. Dayata Valmarie C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose Vilmar and Maricel Dayata. The Real Jeremy A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesse and Giselle The Real. Gonzalez Jasmine A. Parents, Miss Daily A. Gonzalez. Losterio Ina J. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon and Mary Chris Losterio. Monterde Rachel Ann P. Parents, Miss Mary Ann P. Monterde. Peliazo Maria Todeth G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Galberto and Edeth Peliazo. Pipito Ann B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Manuelito and Mary Ann Pipito. Paris Jasmine R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jason and Joscora Perez. Punay Camille Rose B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leo and Vivian Punay. Punay Clea May B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leo and Vivian Punay. Rosacenia Chriselle May C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher and Shinita Rosacenia. Rosal Eugene May A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eugenio and Helen Rosal. Rosel Jane Marie Q. Parents, Miss Rachel Q. Rosel. Saison Rainy S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis and Maricel Saison. Next, Grade 10 Maple. Class Advisor, Mrs. Maria Daini P. Coyoco.
Grade 10 Maple. Alita Alex G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo and Jonah Alita. Alunsagay James Anthony D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ray and Jezebel Alunsagay. Alvarez Gerald B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Pablito and Marivic Alvarez. Angaray Michael J. V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Federico and Nonelin Angaray. Argawanon Renmar S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marlon and Karina Argawanon. Arminion Clinton C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Junjun and Annalisa Arminion. Ariasgado Adrian A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raul and Tomasa Ariasgado. Ariasgado Jose Ray R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marcelino and Cristina Ariasgado. Baconador Mark Rodney P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Enriquito and Elaine Baconador. Canales Clint Albert L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel and Mary Grace Canales. Canales Renante P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo and Maria Canales. Coyuca Christian James A. Parent, Miss Candelaria Coyuca. Evangelista Justin A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey and Mylene Evangelista. Fajardo Jefferson C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anisito and Luz Fajardo. Jolina Jonathan A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodante and Merlina Jolina. Helbuena James Harold A. Parent, Mr. Jose Arnel Helbuena. Lavarete Clint R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nelito and Jehan Lavarete. Maloloyon Jomar R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario and Joanne Maloloyon. Munyaske John Lloyd A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roy and Joanne Munyaske. Pahuway Frank A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Francisco and Mila Pahuway. Placencia Marcelo G. Parent, Mr. Francisco Placencia. Ramos John Vor D. Parent, Mrs. Maria Joneline Ramos. Rosasenia Bryant R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Delo and Candelaria Rosasenia. Rosal John Lee A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rinaldo and Rosemary Rosel. Taok Clyde Vincent G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Liza Taok. Yase John Paul P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Celso and Marifel Yase. Aluba Angel R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alan and Mary Jane Aluba. Andrino Janeline R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rolando and Marites Andrino. Arsenal Courtney P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alexander and Marita Arsenal. Arojado Hanelen B. Parent, Mr. Gonzalo Arojado. Barrio Quinto Farawena S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo and Rowena Barrio Quinto. Bachancela Mary Joy E. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roberto and Lorna Bachancela. Cabiao L'Oreal A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arnel and Jocelyn Cabiao. Condes Juveline A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Annabel Condes. Cuyuca Crystal Ann C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Leonardo and Irish Cuyuca. Dublin Jezebel A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Celso and Evelyn Dublin. Bucante Rizamel P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Armando and Lourdes Ducante. Escanilla Florime D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dorso and Roslyn Escanilla. Espinosa Aliana Lynn S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis and Janet Espinosa. Hihapon Jezame A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joel and Veronica Hihapon. Intrampas Janeline R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Jr. and Francisca Intrampas. Hagdon Hariza P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harold K. and Riza Hagdon. Nogra Josh Marie A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Arturo and Madonna Nogra. Pipito Annalyn D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ananias and Elena Pipito. Pipito Mary Chris A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Eduardo Jr. and Evelyn Pipito. Perino Rhea May P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richie and Cherry Perino. Rosasenia Candy Maureen D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Editha Rosasenia. Rosal Bernadine C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Bernardo and Maricel Lantaca. Rosal Christine Jewel P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Norbert and Geraldine Rosal. Sergaol Aliana Pearl A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jose and Ruth Sergaol. Next, Grade 10 Molave, Class Advisor, Miss Sheena M. Cabras.
Grade 10 Molavi. Ariglado Christian S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Felix and Merlinda Ariglado. Ariglo Aaron Jiv L. Parent, Mrs. Chalita Ariglo. Atelio Alfredo II B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alfredo Jr. and Rosalie Atelio. Batyansela Janly M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Janilit and Gigilin Batyansela. Baybayon Remart R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nilon and Rosefi Baybayon. Brunes Kevin T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Carmelita Briones. Karatao Keith Martin C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Martin Androchi Karatao. Compuesto Aaron A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Feliciano and Merly Compuesto. Conde Jade Vincent C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Emerson and Chrislyn Conde. Condes Mark Bryan. Parent, Miss Maria Luz Condes. Kusip Harry M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rooney and Leah Kusip. Kutab Mario Jr. M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mario and Sheila Kutab. Humakin Vince Jake C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jupiter and Arcitis Humakin. Moya Jovetrel A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall and Rochelle Moya. Pipito Justin M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jeffrey and Michelle Pipito. Postrero Rexel P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rodito and Maria Devana Pipito. Punay Dexter R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Zinaido and Judetha Punay. Reyes Ricky C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Samuel and Emilene Reyes. Rosasinia Maurets D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Dominador and Juanita Rosasinia. Robio Edison Jr. C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edison and Zosima Robio. Santosidad Michael John D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. GC and Rowena Santosidad. Selva Daniel Y. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Richard and Jane Selva. Tabanao Yobert B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Inimisio and Evangeline Tabanao. Taok Francis Jonel B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roderick and Annalyn Taok. Villamor Darwin Jr. C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Darwin and Gremlin Villamor. Yasi Arnoldo II S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Restituto and Elenita Yasi. Yutrago Clark K. B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joshua and Lynn Yutrago. Arisgado Jamela Joyce G. Guardian, Mrs. Riza A. Monterdi. Barrioquento Lordimi S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rayson and Maricel Barrioquento. Borasca Hazel Rose A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Helbert and Alchi Borasca. Calvo Nicole P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Antonio and Susana Calvo. Chavez Arabila Marie S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Andy and Jennifer Chavez. Espinosa Franzel A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hilarion and Erlinda Espinosa. Fernandez Liza M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Santiago and Lucita Fernandez. Gambala Jackie C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Tomasito and Imelda Gambala. Gomez Yusel P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ezekiel and Jocelyn Gomez. Gomez Lian Claire R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert and Lordeliza Gomez. Golfan Rosan D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Adilon and Delma Golfan. Osminia Ashbel Cora P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jinky and Joliet Osminia. Pagnanawon Decimi B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Danilo and Melba Pagnanawon. Pipito Mary Ann G. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Christopher and Virginia Pipito. Placer Gisa P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. GC and Maria Luisa Placer. Kinagan Ginny Grace B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Petronilo and Ethel Kinagan. Reyes Jaya M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jorico and Bilin Reyes. Rodrigo Joan A. Parent, Mrs. Maricel Rodrigo. Rosasinia Claire P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rocky and Margie Rosasinia. Rosasinia Siren Rose P. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall and Welma Rosasinia. Rosel Irish J. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ambrosio and Ami Rosel. Rosquitis Bernadette A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fernando and Asuncion Rosquitis. Yasi Ginilyn R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Julian and Aurora Yasi. Next, Grade 10 Rosewood. Class Advisor, Miss Willa R. Arisgado.
Grade 10 Rosewood. Alahid Janmar D. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nieve Angeli Alahid. Aldea Frenzel L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Marshall and Robeline Aldea. RCP Aldon M. Parents, Mr. Daniel RCP. Arreglo Kirby R. Parent, Mr. Alexander Arreglo. Bartolome Hendrel Jake A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hilario and Robeline Bartolome. Bombarda Giancarlo L. Parent, Mrs. Carmelita Bombarda. Bularon Kirk Ray O. Parent, Mrs. Rialane O. Bularon. Buot John Vincent A. Parent, Mrs. Maria Geraldine A. Buot. Kundi Christian Paul B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rafael and Bibeline Conde. Conde Luigi R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lloyd and Gina Conde. Herbisi John Clifford B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roxenberg and Maricel Herbisi. Gipdano Joaquin L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Joanne and Almera Gipdano. Lidisma Clyde Vincent R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Calvin and Felicitas Lidisma. Monyaski Gino C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Jesus Jr. and Elma Monyaski. Monyaski Rainier C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edgar and Emmeline Monyaski. Mondihar Alan Nino S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Alan and Merlinda Mondihar. Mondihar Major B. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Mariano and Joanna Mondihar. Pipito John Yama D. Parents, Miss Reina Dublin. Pitogos Vincent A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Edison and Ninette Pitogo. Placencia John Benedict C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roland and Carla Vinette Placencia. Rodrigo Neo A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Adelaido and Helen Rodrigo. Rodrigo Ramon Jr. L. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ramon and Cecilia Rodrigo. Rosel Raymart C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Efren and Editha Rosel. Robio Tyrone John. Parent, Miss Roby Robio. Saraga Rovic R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roy and Idnalane Saraga. Sericon Jason C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and Annabel Sericon. Sosas Nino C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger and Delilah Sosas. Taran Brian Y. Parent, Mrs. Bienvenida Taran. Tondag Nino S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rizalito and Filomena Tundag. Ungab Archie M. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roger and Marifi Ungab. Bilyarin Christian Matthew. Parent, Mrs. Irene Villarin. Abaldi Samantha Claire. Parent, Miss Dorinda A. Librero. Alahid Rosa May R. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Raul and Marites Alahid. Alahid Roslyn V. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Roy and Michelle Alahid. Arsenal Nia Gwyneth A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Nolan and Chuna Arsenal. Arenas Maria Angelica S. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Renee Boy and Christina Arenas. Ariglamos Lee Joy T. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Romeo and Dailinda Ariglamos. Ariglo Rizion C. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Saturnino and Rosana Ariglo. Arcelon Crystal May A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Vicente and Marilyn Arcelon. Bantilan Cynthia A. Parents, Mr. and Mrs. Rogelio and Elin Bantilan.